This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, climate change and life as we know it. Do rising temperatures mean there's no hope?
That does not mean that we can raise our hands and we give up and we say, oh, well, it's too late. The temperatures are rising, because these damages are not sort of going off of a cliff.
How climate affects national security when Radio Health Journal returns.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
There are many times that I resolved the stuff. There are many times that I said I would change or even get help, but then reversed myself.
The all-consuming grasp of addiction. Then,
a lot of the United States is very auto-oriented. So this is an area that our nation really needs to focus on if we want to get people out of those cars and into healthy, active forms of mobility.
Exploring different modes of mobility. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
Sooner or later, climate change will affect everything, the experts say. Before too long, everyday life may depend on an air conditioner, no matter where you live. Crops you see today in the Deep South may one day be at home in Canada, and the melting ice caps may mean your beachfront home is soon underwater. All over the world, governments are wrestling with scenarios like these. Often they're termed a crisis in national security.
The changing climate disrupts the stability on which our world depends from a national security perspective. That's why we call climate change a threat multiplier.
That's Sherry Goodman, a senior strategist at the Center for Climate and Security and former First Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security.
We see that all of the threat multipliers of climate change, for example, sea level rise, more extreme weather events, wildfires, droughts, flooding, permafrost collapse, and many more, impact America's security and our global security.
It may seem to some folks, at least, that there isn't much of a connection here. But actually, if you think about it, there's all aspects of national security that are intimately connected with climate change. Many of the military bases that are situated around the world, US military bases, they are increasingly coming under threat from climate change. This is coming from rising sea levels, cyclones, hurricanes, etc. Right? So a lot of naval bases that are even in the United States are increasingly finding themselves subject to these natural disasters. So immediately you're seeing that there's going to be an impact.
Dr. Tivrat Garg is assistant professor of economics at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. He says climate stress on security piles up from a whole variety of sources. For example, when civilians are hit with a natural disaster in the U.S., it's often the military who are called in to clean up, taking them away from other defense assignments. Climate change has also triggered major international conflict and change that affect us here at home.
Climate change is going to give rise to a myriad of economic and social problems, from an increasing refugee crisis to increasing civil wars and conflicts around the world, to seeing increased aggression and violence that is manifested as a result of rising temperatures. Rising temperatures are also diminishing agricultural yields in some of the poorest parts of the world. This in turn gives rise to organized and individual level violence, each of which is going to present a threat to U.S. national security.
Goodman says one of the greatest climate-caused stressors to American security comes from increased migration around the world. People are moving because they simply can no longer live where they've been.
We have the greatest wave of global migration going on since World War II. And much of that is fueled not only by political instability, but by changing climate conditions. As I said, in some places, it's now become so dry for so long that the land no longer supports the people. and herders and farmers in parts of Africa have come into conflict over water resources. And so that migration, as a good example, what happened in Syria, a prolonged drought fueled the greatest conflagration and human migration in modern times, when the prolonged drought led farmers and herders to migrate towards the urban areas, which then led to civil unrest.
Syria is just one example. Goodman says in repeated instances, in places all over the world, migration is creating economic, sociological, political, and military stress.
Drought is driving populations across northern Africa to migrate to safer havens. But at the same time, it emboldens terrorists to take advantage of vulnerable populations who don't have enough food and water because of prolonged drought in many regions of the world. We also see that some island nations and coastal megacities in Asia and even in our own continent are going to succumb to the rising seas in coming decades. And we see these extreme disruptive events, from the wildfires in Boulder that just occurred, to the fire season that lasts all year round across much of California and across up into Alaska, the Arctic, and across to Siberia, changing the stability of entire regions.
If there is a hurricane or a cyclone, the evacuation of individuals from those regions, you have small island nations that are getting submerged under rising sea levels. As a humanitarian crisis, we have to find places for these individuals to go. At the same time, you're going to see migration that is arising out of a complete loss of economic livelihoods that's directly tied to climate change. Right? So when we know that, when individuals lose legal opportunities of income, and then climate change starts to threaten this, you're going to see an increase in non-legal ways of sourcing livelihoods.
Garg says one extreme example is laid out in a study from Queen Mary University of London.
Climate stressors took place off the coast of Indonesia, and you saw that in areas where there were spikes in temperatures and sea surface temperatures directly tied to climate change. So you saw a depletion of ideal fishing conditions. Those were exactly the places where you saw an increase in piracy attacks. So what you're seeing is young people who were initially going to be in the fishing industry, they're no longer being able to get the right amount of catch, this migratory patterns that are arising out of fish, and they are then seeking other forms of livelihood. And the fact that climate change is going to be affecting livelihoods and at various parts of the income distribution in various parts of the world, those people are going to seek opportunities elsewhere, like economic opportunities. They need to be able to feed their families, etc.
Migration from Latin America is what we're most familiar with in the United States. Goodman says climate change contributes to that, too.
Central America is rife with a combination of political instability from fragile governments that don't take care of their people. But at the same time, they've been racked by multiple hurricanes in a row across Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador that have brought extreme conditions from which people have a tough time recovering because the societies are not that resilient to start with, and the economic opportunities are marginal even in good times. And that sense makes people desperate and sends families trying to flee across the border.
Climate change is even creating global tensions in the middle of the ocean. We may think of the Arctic, for example, as locked in ice, but that's not true anymore. And if the sea lanes are open in the Arctic, who's going to control them?
Russia, for example, envisions its northern sea route, which hugs the vast Russian coastline, the largest coastline, as a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia like Shanghai across to ports in Europe like Rotterdam. And China claims it could save several weeks in shipping time by using such sea lanes in the future. And it's not only for the sea routes, but for what's in the sea and under the sea bed. So under the sea bed is thought to be very valuable minerals and fossil resources, which Arctic nations like Russia and others will, and the US has some of these as well, may want to exploit in the future.
But even that isn't all. The Arctic is a productive fishing territory for those who control it, and as the ocean warms, sea life is migrating toward the North Pole. Meanwhile, people may have to migrate away from the ocean shore because beachfront cities are endangered. Enormous ice shelves in Greenland and Antarctica are cracking and threatening to collapse. If they do, sea level could rise dramatically.
We've already had, along much of the eastern seaboard in the U.S., we've already had well over 1.5 feet of sea level rise in the last half century in places like Norfolk, Virginia, where we have our major military bases, naval bases, and parts of the coast. But with the collapse of the Thwaites Glacier and other more rapidly occurring cracks that could occur across parts of Antarctica, we could see a couple of feet more of sea level rise within a decade. And if that should occur, that will both swamp some major cities like Miami and New Orleans, but mega cities like Dhaka in Bangladesh, other parts of India, across major cities in China and across Asia.
As a result of all of this, environmental treaties are becoming more and more critical. But Garg says figuring out what to do about all this while still protecting the nation's interests is difficult.
A lot of the damages from climate change are being caused by rich, high-income nations. They have been the traditional polluters. They have been the traditional engines of the carbon economy. That's where a lot of this has been happening. But the impacts are being disproportionately borne in other parts of the world. And this is for 3 reasons. One, just because of where a lot of low and middle-income countries are located, the highest increases in raw temperatures are going to be around those belts. But the second is that because these are largely agrarian economies, they also are more vulnerable to climate disasters. So the economic livelihoods of individuals are much more tied to climate than they are, say, in the United States, right? In the United States, there's about less than 3% of the workforce that's directly involved in agriculture. In India, it's a much higher number. And so what you end up seeing is that distinction really matters because livelihoods are less climate sensitive in the US than they are perhaps in other parts of the world.
Many Americans can adapt to warming temperatures more easily than those in poorer nations. For example, we can turn on the air conditioner. People in other parts of the world may not be able to afford one, nor the electricity to run it. Garg says the economic disparity puts a lot of responsibility on us to help find solutions and help pay for them.
For a lot of people, it's going to mean a damage in livelihoods. Now, that can mean making investments in heat-resistant crops. You know, in a lot of countries, the CGIAR network has done a lot of work in trying to improve the diffusion of heat-resistant crops. It also means that having better safety net programs. If somebody's income is reliant on agriculture and you have a really hot year, we need to have a support net for those individuals.
What we may forget is that there's something in it for us in helping others. We don't live in a vacuum in the world. One of Garg's studies shows that payments to somebody else can mean a lot to us.
What we show is that there is this relationship between temperature and violence in Mexico, for example, but the rollout of a cash transfer program can really substantially weaken that relationship. And what that tells us is that these inexpensive cash transfers, relatively inexpensive cash transfers, can play a very major role in adaptation to climate change. And what that means from the US standpoint is that this is a very cost-effective investment from a national security standpoint.
But how much reassurance is that? Some people wonder if it's already too late to do something about climate change and ensure our very survival. But Garg says that's not the right way to think about it.
There exist a fair number of carbon emissions in the atmosphere already, and there are going to be certain temperature increases that we see no matter what we do. That does not mean that we can raise our hands and we give up and we say, oh, well, it's too late, the temperatures are rising, because these damages are not sort of going off of a cliff. There's not sort of, yes, we're going to see increases in temperature. Some of that is going to be bad, but it doesn't have to be as bad as if we don't do anything about it.
You can find out more about Sherry Goodman, Tivrat Garg, and all of our guests through links on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. I'm Reed Pence. Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
There's
a lot of evidence that early gross motor behavior can actually be indicative of longer-term developmental and cognitive outcomes.
How the pandemic affects brain development of new infants.
Then do you get the winter blues?
I just thought this was normal. And then when I moved to the sun, I realized, oh my gosh, this is what you're supposed to feel like.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.